very large, but it's very much like the rest of the Vietnamese economy, where it's this informal gray economy. Next slide, please. So one of the questions are, well, with the limited number of firms that are listed in the market, how come there aren't more firms listed? And here, I think, is the crux of the problem. The first thing is that the state-owned enterprises, or the companies that have good ties to the government, get cheap bank credit. Okay. Back when Vietnam was a complete command economy, state-owned enterprises got subsidies from the government. As the country economy got reformed, that's obviously not what you want to do. Subsidize these state-owned enterprises. So what the government has done is to help them through an indirect way, something called policy lending, where they direct state banks to lend money to state enterprises, okay, at cheap rates that these enterprises should not be getting. Well, the consequence of that is these become bad loans because they don't get repaid. And now there's a huge issue that now called non-performing loans, NPLs, where these banks now have all these bad loans, and these loans have sucked up all the credit in the economy. And ultimately, the government will have to bail out these banks. So they've just postponed the cost, and it's just a backward subsidy for the state-owned enterprises. But going back to the stock market, the reason why these enterprises haven't needed to list is that they can borrow cheaply from the government at basically subsidy rates where the government's giving money away. The second thing is that private companies in Vietnam are still very wary of transparency, because by being transparent, you open yourself up to being to shakedowns where government officials audit your books and demand payments. I had a chance to speak with a very successful entrepreneur in Vietnam, and I asked the person, there's so many vibrant young companies in Vietnam, and what would take those companies to become large companies that can compete nationally and globally? And the person said, well, for Vietnamese firms, there's an incentive not to grow too big, because once you get big, you get noticed, there's a shakedown. So that's the second reason why firms aren't listing, because they don't want to get attracted attention. And what this all says basically is the problem that you see in Vietnam is this lack of a level playing field, where firms that are close to the government get tremendous preferential treatment, and firms that aren't don't get that. And this discrimination has a lot of economic effects. Next slide, please. I think here it's also important to look at how the foreign community has been involved through the years. Now, in the early 1990s, there was tremendous enthusiasm, and at that time, over $400 million was raised by venture capital funds. Okay, and as many of you probably know, a venture capital fund is a fund that invests in companies before they go on the stock market. The idea is to fund these companies like startups, and then to sell them off, usually on the stock market. And at the time, there was an expectation that Vietnam would reform the stock market as early as 1995. That didn't happen, and there was a period of disappointment between 1996 and 2002 when no venture capital funding was raised for the country. And in fact, of the about a dozen funds that were formed in the early 90s, only one still exists today. The rest have all gone out of business. Since 2002, you have seen a resumption of investment in the country. However, there are still some significant obstacles. The first, again, is the issue of transparency. And it's not just the transparency of companies, it's the transparency of the government. A lot of foreign investors aren't sure what their tax rates are going to be, or whether they can take the money out of the country, so to their profits. So it's very gray, very unclear. So that's been an obstacle. The other one is the issue of corporate governance. We hear a lot about this in the U.S. now. The idea of shareholders having rights. That's not understood in the context of it now, not surprisingly, especially for minority investors. So it's very hard for somebody to put money in a company and not have a voice. Okay, that's a thing we see in the country as a whole, where you don't have a voice. The other issue is the cap on the amount of ownership a foreign firm can have. And basically, there's this 30% cap where no foreign firm can own more than 30% of any local entity. Next slide. So, given all these issues, and you would think still that this equity market now should take off. Just from a very simple way of looking at it, is from a supply standpoint, there are a lot of local firms in need of long-term financing. I think there are a lot of companies that have very promising capabilities, especially taking advantage of the VTA and increased trade. You see a lot of Vietnamese agribusiness firms, especially shrimp and catfish, who can be very competitive. So there's a supply of companies who really need that financing. At the same time, there's a demand. There's a lot of people who want to provide financing, want to invest in these companies. This demand is not just the foreign capital, which there's a lot of demand for Vietnam, but also locally. One thing that I think that we sometimes overlook is the amount of money that's inside Vietnam. According to some estimates, very conservatively, just in the Saigon area, families have $1 billion stuck under the mattress. Nationally, there may be up to $5 billion hidden away. All that money is looking for productive ways to invest. And currently, most of it is just going either under the mattress or in things such as real estate. The reason why there's a big skyrocketing boom in real estate now is people have no other place to put their money. Like we would have here in the U.S. where people can invest in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, which didn't get recycled and help grow the economy. Vietnam doesn't have that avenue. Next slide, please. So again, what hasn't ended is the transparency, the lack of the playing field, and also something else that we summarize in one word, and that's equitization. By not calling Duy Hoang privatization what it really is, shows that there's still this inconsistency between wanting to have economic reform but not accepting the political reality, having to use buzzwords and not being committed to full-scale reform. And that's captured in that one word. Next slide, please. So to conclude, what are the consequences for Vietnam? Well, first of all, when you have this underdeveloped stock market, you can have a very large, unregulated, informal market where people are just doing transactions on the side. And that has a risk of leading to some tremendous financial scandal or loss of confidence. We know that in some of these cultures that even investing is viewed as gambling, right? Just stock. So it's gambling. So it can lead to this speculation where this happened in the former countries of Eastern Europe, where you can lose tremendous confidence in the economy because of some scam. The second thing is because there's not this transparency and so forth, firms in Vietnam are undervalued. They're not sold for what they're worth. One way to measure a way to value a company is through its price-earning ratio. For instance, for every dollar of earnings, what investors are willing to pay on top of that. In China, typical PEs have been about 30. So for every dollar, investors are paying $30 for the company. In Vietnam, for the last several years, it's been about 5. So investors are basically paying about 6 times as much for Chinese firms than Vietnamese firms. So because of the bad policies in Vietnam. And a result of that, then, Vietnam is not going to attract investment capital. Okay, and the consequences of this less investment capital is going to be less growth, less productivity in order to compete with the rest of the world, and more importantly, less opportunity. Because unless you have access to this market, you're going to have a situation where only some people can have access. And anytime you have limited access, it means people with preferred treatment will do better. And that goes back to the whole inequality issue of that economy. And I would like to conclude, the last slide please, by this observation of a foreign investor in Vietnam. And that is, Vietnam is a developed country intellectually, it happens to be poor. Vietnam là một nước tân tiến về trí tuệ nhưng vẫn là nghèo. Okay. Thì it just shows the potential in the country, but the reality. And here I'd like to end. Xin cảm ơn quý vị.